Hi everyone, welcome to this video which tries to answer the question, what is a knowledge-rich curriculum? My name is George Douglas. I'm the School Improvement Lead for Science for Greenshaw Learning Trust. I also lead the Curriculum Leadership Network for Greenshaw Learning Trust, and I've been lucky enough to work with some fantastic people and find out about the kind of training they offer to their middle and senior leaders on the curriculum. In particular, I hosted a session last week with Graham Dakin from Henley Bank High School and Josie Shelton from Blaze High School, both of which are Greenshaw Learning Trust schools. And from that, I decided to try and bring together some of their ideas around what training to offer to middle and senior leaders, and put them into a series of short videos. So this is the first of those short videos. It's worth saying when we talk about curriculum, it doesn't tend to be quite as actionable as the kind of stuff that we do on teaching and learning or behaviour or perhaps even assessment and things like that. But it's important nonetheless because it frames all of those other things, because really the function of schools is to pass on knowledge. And when we're thinking about the curriculum, really we're thinking about knowledge. And as I'm going to talk about in this video, the developments over the last 50 or more years have led to this point where we're talking about knowledge an awful lot. And in particular, you'll hear this phrase or phrases like it of a knowledge-rich curriculum. And what I want to do in this video is tell a story about how we got to the point at which this phrase knowledge-rich curriculum is one that's used widely amongst teachers, and give my account of what that means and kind of what it doesn't mean. So this is a story. I'm going to tell a kind of historical story. It's not necessarily the be-all and end-all. I think there would be academics who would quibble with the way I have laid things out here. But it's a start. What I want to do in this video is just give a kind of mental model, just to help whoever's watching this to think about what's going on a bit more clearly and understand why these questions are important. So what I'm going to do is try and go through developments in teachers thinking about the curriculum since the middle of the 20th century. And what I'm going to try and do is illustrate what I think are the two poles of curriculum thinking amongst teachers, which are number one, accessibility, and number two, rigor. And hopefully it will become clear what those two mean. But I think it's really important that we understand the developments in the 20th century with some sort of mental model like this. And I think this one is about as simple but yet still accurate a model as I can come up with. So if we think back to the pre-1960s, it was really all about rigor. And actually no one really talks about curriculum as far as I'm aware. The curriculum was something that was kind of just taken for granted. So subjects were essentially controlled by the universities. They decided what would go on the tests. Teachers taught that. They probably had textbooks that were also printed by the universities. And the way it worked was it kind of worked in two ways. So firstly, if you were in an elite school, you kind of understood that this is what you had to do. So if we put elite schools here, you needed to do what the teacher told you, and that was your way of accessing the universities. But then there was this whole mess, especially in the early 20th century, there was this whole mess of other schools that weren't really properly organised, and there was a whole mix of different kind of categories of school and so on. In the 19th century, of course, the schools weren't even, there was lots of voluntary schools, school wasn't compulsory. In the 20th century, it became compulsory for all people, but the ages at which people finished school varied, and it was really not particularly well organised. Politically, there were lots of Great British fudges, and there wasn't really a coherent system. Now that kind of changed in 1944. At the end of the war, there was this big kind of upheaval, and we ended up with what's called the tripartite system in state schools. So this is the system where you had the grammar schools and the 11 plus. So the most academically able students would enter the grammar schools. You also had secondary modern schools, and you also had technical schools as well. And this is kind of how it was. And again, no one really talked about curriculum. It was just, you were either academic and you went down that track and you did what the university said you needed to do to enter the universities, or you weren't. And you kind of, you were kind of assumed to be a little bit deficient. And maybe, if you were a working class student, let's say, well, yeah, that was just it. You were never going to be academic anyway. That was the thinking. Now, over the course of the kind of 1950s and early 1960s, discontentment started to grow around this system. And you started to get some changes happening, especially in around the late 1960s. So one of the developments that happened was we began to move away from this tripartite system to comprehensive schools. So I'll add comprehensive schools in here. So the idea of comprehensive schools were that everything would be under one roof, and all students from all backgrounds would come together in this place of learning. And there was still some of the old assumptions there, but it was supposed to be a bit more egalitarian. And what I'm going to do is show that, or kind of argue that that was part of a move away from kind of rigor and making sure that the rigor was there and trying to make learning more accessible. Because the questions that people asked about this were questions like, well, why is it that the universities get to decide what students learn at school? Isn't it a bit unfair that the elite schools seem to have much easier access to universities than those in normal schools? And is it right that we're branding whole swathes of working class students as somehow deficient? Maybe there's something wrong with the curriculum and the organisation of schools itself. So we've got comprehensive schools here. We also began to adopt some different approaches to pedagogy and different approaches to curriculum as well. So in terms of the curriculum, what you saw in the late 1960s and 1970s was these kind of boundaries between school knowledge and everyday knowledge being blurred. So I'll put, more of a focus, let's say, on everyday or real world contexts. And in terms of pedagogy, and what that means is, rather than just focusing on very kind of abstract academic concepts, students were encouraged to bring their own understandings of the world into the classroom more. So it wasn't just, you need to learn this, it was, tell us what you think about this. And that was a curriculum issue, but that kind of went hand in hand with a pedagogical development, which was this idea of child-centered learning, which became really popular and widespread in the 1960s and 70s. And this kind of theoretically originated in the late 60s, but this spread massively. This gained loads and loads of traction across English schools in the 1970s. But it wasn't without its naysayers. There were some people who weren't quite happy with this approach and these developments. So you had these papers being published called the Black Papers, which were essentially saying, we've lost everything that schools are supposed to be about, and children are just playing, and they're not. This is not real schooling, and so on. And there was this kind of process which culminated towards the end of Margaret Thatcher's time in power at the end of the 1980s, whereby actually a lot of these changes were reversed. So what happened was in the late 1980s. So the first thing that we can talk about is that we had the national curriculum introduced. So this was introduced by Kenneth Baker under Margaret Thatcher in 1988. And the idea behind this was to kind of take back control, to use a controversial phrase, to take back control of what was happening in schools from the teachers. Because it was felt that, especially over the course of the 60s and 70s, that teachers had been given too much autonomy to do what they want. And actually what that had ended up with was, according to people on the kind of rigor side of things, what that had led to is students not learning what they needed to learn. So that's why a national curriculum was set up to make sure that every child was being given access to the knowledge that the government at that time thought was important. Not long after that, again, as a means of, I suppose, reducing the autonomy of teachers and making sure that there was some kind of centralised, nationalised standards in place, Ofsted was incarnated in its current form. So that was in 1992. And what this did is essentially move away from that child-centered learning to much more, it wanted to make sure that rather than students focusing on everyday contexts, there were some concepts that were stipulated in this national curriculum that every school had to teach. So it was a way of the idea was to bring back some of this rigour that people felt had been lost with these developments in the 60s and 70s. Now, what you saw then over time, and especially as we get to the late 1990s and the early noughties, if I just, I've just realised I was covered there. So as we move towards those, to this later era, what you started to get there was this kind of erosion of those developments. So there was this movement, especially around the time of New Labour, towards what are called 21st century skills. And the national curriculum over time, and this culminated in 2007 when Ed Balls was responsible, but this culminated in a national curriculum with way fewer concepts, so way fewer academic abstract concepts, and much more of a focus on, again, going back to everyday real world kind of learning type thing, and there was more autonomy for schools again. So you see, it was felt that the kind of rigour that was encoded in the original national curriculum was not necessarily accessible to all students, and this is why we had this big movement, and many people teaching today will remember this national curriculum. There was a lot of focus on kind of everyday applications of knowledge, not as much focus on kind of hard, let's say, rigorous academic concepts. And as I'm sure we all know, there was a backlash to that as well. So we then swing back again to Michael Gove. So we've got the Gove reforms that happened in the 2010s. And here he instigated a review of the national curriculum, and it was felt that a lot of the concepts had been lost, that actually that wasn't really good for social justice. That there was lots of arguments made around powerful knowledge and all of this sort of thing. But what we ended up with was a national curriculum with more concepts again. And in the late 2010s, we had Ofsted beginning to inspect on the curriculum and make sure that the curriculum was not being narrowed, and that students were getting access to this rich range of concepts and not just being taught to pass tests and so on. Which brings us roughly to where we are today. So we've had the Gove reforms, we're still working under this national curriculum. What I hope you can see is there's been this back and forth for 50, 60, 70 years now between this idea of rigour and making sure that this disciplinary knowledge is encoded in the curriculum, that all students have access to it, but also accessibility. And this kind of push for people saying, well, hang on, not every student is able to access these abstract academic concepts. What are we doing to make sure that they can find school meaningful and I suppose enjoyable? So if I zoom out a bit, I'm not going to be able to get this whole picture in, but these are the two poles I suppose we've been working or I've been understanding the developments in terms of. So if we go back down to here and these Gove reforms, if I just zoom in again, I suppose the point here is we've got two options now, or we had two options after these Gove reforms. So option number one is that we just stick to this kind of pure rigour track and say, okay, we've put more concepts into the national curriculum. Let's go back to basics, back to traditional teaching. And what does that look like? Well, that looks like, in terms of the curriculum and resources, let's get the textbooks out, let's read the textbooks, here's the knowledge students need to know. If they don't know it, that's their fault. We can do lecturing, so really old school traditional teaching, so we just tell students stuff and it's on them to know it, they just need to know blah blah blah. And the focus on assessment is much more summative. It's about ranking students, it's about deciding who's clever and who's not. And I'm deliberately using some quite emotive language here, I suppose, because the point is that there's a danger that we can just do this and go back to this very old school traditional approach to teaching, and then there's inevitably going to be a backlash, and then we're going to move much more towards skills and so on. And actually, we've kind of ignored all of these arguments that were made over the course of the 20th century on the accessibility side of things. And I don't think that's what a knowledge curriculum, a knowledge-rich curriculum, I beg your pardon, is all about. I think what a knowledge-rich curriculum is all about is trying to find a happy medium. So when we talk about a knowledge-rich curriculum, I beg your pardon, so let's put knowledge-rich. I don't think we're just saying let's dust off the old textbooks from the 1960s and you know, get students sitting in rows and in silence for the sake of it. I think what this is all about is saying, okay, how do we make sure that students get access to this rigorous disciplinary knowledge, and we'll talk about the disciplines a little bit more in the next video. How do we make sure students get access to that without losing its rigor? So we want it to be accessible and rigorous at the same time. And what you've seen here in terms of the resources that we have, this is why there's been so much conversation over the past 10 years about curriculum, and everyone's going on about curriculum because actually it's really, really difficult. How do you make it rigorous and accessible? That's really, really hard. So this is where, this is what's going to frame everything that we talk about in subsequent videos here. But this is about having a really well thought through curriculum. So in terms of how you order it, what concepts you choose to teach, how you make explicit links between the concepts and the different ideas, what resources you use to support that, all of that is what we mean by a knowledge-rich curriculum, to make it rigorous and accessible. A lot of that, at the moment, is tied in with explicit teaching. So it's not, let's lecture from the textbook, kind of how I was often taught, and I'm sure you had a similar experience, but it's also not child-centered, discovery-type learning. Sometimes this is called direct instruction. Direct instruction comes from teaching students with quite complex needs. The idea of explicit teaching is to have rigorous teaching that is accessible to every single student. So again, that's where a lot of these ideas come from. And then instead of the focus being on summative assessment, let's just rank people and kind of decide who's clever and who's not. There's much more of a focus on formative assessment, what we often call in schools checking for understanding, to really try and understand how students are thinking about the world, to what extent they've moved on from their everyday understandings of the world, and they're thinking about it in terms of disciplinary ones. So constantly seeing how students think in order that we can change the way they think so that it aligns with the disciplines. So this, when we talk about what is a knowledge-rich curriculum, I think this is what it's all about. It's a curriculum that's both rigorous and accessible. It's not textbooks and lecturing and loads of exams. It's thinking really hard about how we organise knowledge within our subjects. It's thinking really hard about the pedagogy that we employ and making sure that pedagogy is subject specific. And it's thinking really, really hard about how we check for student understanding. That is a knowledge-rich curriculum. In the next video, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the disciplines and how they relate to our subjects.